Cath was a restless soul. Of his childhood in the village of Sur, deep in the valley of Ulwar, beneath Black Mountain, legend says little, only that the boy grew to manhood with a certain glint in his eye, a longing to understand certain secret matters belonging to timeless folklore and obscure rumour. The boy, and then the young man, had a hunger that the bountiful fruit of the North tree and the sparkling juice of the Huangberry could not quench, for it was a hunger of the mind. Some say that it all started when a wandering poet, following the river Llan, came to the village of Sur. The wizened bard sang his verses in the village square and, before leaving, took time to single out a bright-eyed lad, a blacksmith's apprentice, for a moment of whispered converse in the shade of a giant tree standing at one edge of the square. What special gleam the old man had seen in young Cath's eyes it is difficult to say, but single him out he did. "You will seek the mystery of the Daemon-Sultan," the poet croaked to the boy. Cath, then only 12 years old, was intrigued. "The Daemon-Sultan?" The old man nodded his grizzled head. "Yes, the Daemon-Sultan, whom the narcotic manuscripts call Azathoth, the lord of all existence, him at whose feet strange shapes gather, and at whose sides strange flutists play." "And I will seek him?" the boy asked. "You will seek him," the bard replied. "And where will I seek him?" the boy asked. "At the centre of all chaos," the bard replied. "And where is the centre of all chaos?" the boy asked, but the wind blew up a bit of sand, and by the time the boy had wiped his eyes to clear them, the old man was gone. From that time onward, Cath had a certain discontent, a wanderlust of spirit. Recalling the poet's cryptic words, he yearned to know the secret of darkly fabled Azathoth, the Daemon-Sultan. As Cath grew towards maturity, he found ever more articulate ways of asking about the matter that consumed his curiosity. He consulted the scholars of his village, the keepers of rare old books, but found none who professed to know much of the narcotic manuscripts to which the poet had alluded, beyond their being an exceedingly ancient and obscure repository of ill-regarded lore. Cath with much difficulty obtained an interview one night with the chief shaman of the village, an aged man whose wisdom was respected throughout the valley of Ulwar, yet even he had little to say of the Daemon-Sultan. "Know this," the shaman muttered over a smoking brazier of incense. "He who seeks the Daemon-Sultan should ponder one crucial point, that sometimes one encounters what one seeks." He would say no more, and Cath despaired to think that he had exhausted the avenues available to him in his humble birthplace. But, working sedulously in his apprenticeship to the village blacksmith, he saved the polished stones which served as currency in those days, and upon coming of age had saved enough to set out on his own, in quest of that dark knowledge that had eluded him. One grey and drizzly morning, donning a new robe and sandals, and embracing his tearful mother and his sad-faced father, and promising them that he would be careful, he took to the road, little knowing how many years his journey would consume. No citizen of Ser had ever travelled even to the end of the valley of Ulwar, but there Cath wandered, and far beyond. In every village along the river Llan, throughout the length of the valley, it was the same. The people, simple hard-working folk with little time for legends or idle speculation, would eye him, a stranger, with quiet suspicion, though their inns and taverns would shelter and feed him in exchange for a few of the polished stones he carried in his pack. He would sit near the villagers of an evening and hear the songs by the fire, but of the Daemon-Sultan he learnt virtually nothing. No one had heard of such a one, or almost no one. At the westernmost village before one passed from the valley altogether, a young cobbler confided to Cath that his grandmother had once spoken of a Daemon-Sultan, saying that her own grandmother had remembered, from the time when she was a girl, seeing a tall, mysterious man pass through the village, a man whispered about, in those far-away times, as the Daemon-Sultan, whose domain was all of creation. At this Cath marvelled, for it meant that the shadowy god whom he sought had apparently once taken human form. But the details were blurred by the mists of time, and of this remote family recollection the earnest young cobbler could tell him no more. Shouldering his pack, Luecath moved on. Crossing the bleak mountains out of which the river Llan flowed, and making his way into the valley beyond, the young traveller followed a broad, wild river for many weeks, until he came to first one village beside the turbulent waters, then another and another, seemingly without end. Of new peoples and customs and dress he learned much, but of Azathoth the Daemon-Sultan, nothing. The farther he ventured from his home, the more suspicious the villagers were of such a stranger as he, though he always strove to show them by his manner that he was not a threat to them. Questioning old men and lizard-visaged beldams around hearth-fires in venerable inns, he heard countless legends, but when he asked about the Daemon-Sultan, silence would fall, and he thought the faces grew solemn with subtle misgivings, even with fear. He would learn nothing new, and he would move on. Following the wide river, he ultimately passed out of this valley and ascended another ponderous chain of mountains, in whose densely foliage-shrouded foothills he would sometimes stop at night to break bread with oddly quiet groups of goat-herds about lonely campfires, exchanging stories with them. He hoped to hear something of the Daemon-Sultan, but of this the simple peasants were unable or unwilling to speak, and often they would glance at the darkness brooding beyond the glow of the campfire and shudder. One such evening, a dour-faced man with angularly jutting jaw looked at Luecath long and hard in the flickering firelight, and finally gave him one piece of advice, couched in startlingly poetic language that would remain long in Luecath's mind. "Beyond these mountains, and beyond the valley on the other side, there lies the great sea, on whose opposite shores stretches the plateau of Mli, and at a year's journey beyond that there lies the city of Beccana, which some say exists only in dream, though some claim to have seen its resplendent towers in the distance from certain remote mountain-tops. It is said that in the city of Beccana there lives an exceedingly ancient sage named Li Su, whose learning encompasses frightful matters that others dare not contemplate. If anyone knows of this Daemon-Sultan of whom you speak, it is he. But the city of Beccana may belong more to the nebulous realm of myth and dream than to reality. Perhaps it were better that it should." Luecath, well knowing that there is at best an uncertain distinction between reality and dream, walked on, certain now that one day his quest would come to fruition. Time passed, and the scarcely more than adolescent features of the wanderer Luecath took on the lineaments of careworn time. The young face grew more weary, if not less determined, and a rough beard grew to cover the once boyish cheeks, and the once new robe and sandals became ragged and dusty, so that when he came into a village he must, he thought, have looked like many another road-seasoned vagabond. Whenever his store of polished stones ran dangerously low, he would stop and work in some village blacksmith shop, or do menial tasks of whatever sort he could, to replenish his savings, and in time he would take to the road once more. At times he wondered if he were not mad. What did it mean for a man to spend his life walking, wandering, searching for a clue to something so elusive and esoteric as that which he sought? Lying beside the murmuring waters of some nameless river, he would often scan the night sky with travel-weary eyes, and ask the coyly winking stars where the answer was, but they were always silent, and Luecath would sleep and wake and move on. So many villages had he visited that he could scarcely remember any of them. His memories of them ran melting one into another. But at length the sleepy village that met his gaze one evening was one in which many trading ships rode at anchor along a series of rickety wharves, and he knew that he had reached the near shore of the great sea. Securing passage on one of the ships as a deckhand, he had no experience at sea, but so few were the village loungers who had any desire to behold the great sea's far shore, that he had no difficulty finding a place on the crew. Securing his passage, he sailed one misty morning with his new-found mates, and would not see land again for many months. There was, for him, a magic on the wind at sea, a whispering of secrets that he would savour evenings, lying stretched upon the creaking deck when the day's chores were done. Of his fellow sailors, oddly few seemed inclined to appreciate this magical quality of the sea and the air. Perhaps, he thought, because to them it had grown too familiar. But one old sailor, who called himself Cahan, seemed to share Luecath's sense of the mystical, and they had a most interesting discussion one night on deck, when Luecath had mentioned that he sought to find out about the Daemon-Sultan. "I have seen him," old Cahan declared. "Indeed?" Luecath replied. "Azathoth, the Daemon-Sultan?" "Yes." "What can you tell me? Who is he? Where is he?" The old sailor lit his chewed-off stump of a pipe, and studied the sea for a long while before answering. When he spoke, his language, like that of the goatherd before, was of a curiously poetic cast, the language of one who has pondered long and long over many deep matters in solitude. "The Daemon-Sultan may walk the earth as a man, but he is the lord of all existence. That much the elders of my village have whispered. Azathoth the Daemon-Sultan lies brooding at the centre of all chaos, where unthinkable shapes, servile to him, whine and crouch. Where unthinkable shapes, servile to him, whine and crouch. When the Daemon-Sultan some day spreads forth his arms, the very galaxies shall be scattered like gossamer wisps of spider-web. He is all. He is everywhere. Yet he is nowhere. Yet again, when you seek him, he may lurk closer than you think." And, turning his face to the sea, the old sailor would say no more. One day the rolling sea gave way to a huddled seaport and the plateau lands of the far shore, and Luecath found himself on the road once more, the old seafarer's words ringing in his ears. As open roads became village lanes, and village lanes became open road again, in endless protraction, the traveller pondered all that he knew of the object of his quest, and found it to be precious little, and wondered again at times, if he were not mad, crossing far, unknown new ranges of mountains and threading his way through undreamed of valleys beside meandering streams, beside meandering rivers. He wondered if indeed the fabled city of Beccana existed outside the febrile caprices of legend and dream. But one starry night, as he reached the highest point of a dark and scowling crag, he saw the distant horizon besprinkled with lights, and as these lights dimmed with the advancing dawn, clusters of towers and turrets loomed, and he knew that he had found his city. He descended to the valley floor almost breathless with anticipation, and by the next evening he was walking the labyrinthine cobblestone streets of Beccana. It was a strange city, where crumbling old houses leaned one into another to make arches over dark streets where unplaceable vapours lingered, and where shadowy side-alleys led off into regions unimaginable. But Luecath had still only one abiding thought. Staying at an ivy-covered inn near the great central square, he asked questions, and it was not long before he knew where to find the sage named Li Su. That venerable figure resided in an ancient cottage at the end of an obscure lane, and when Luecath knocked at the great oaken door, he was admitted by a swarthy servant, without question or explanation, as if the old man were expecting him. Li Su, with a saurian face so much folded over with age that it seemed expressionless, sat cross-legged on the earthen floor in a dimly lit back room, with a large time-encrusted book lying open at his side, and motioned for the visitor to sit likewise before him. "I have come," began Luecath. "I know why you have come," Li Su said. He clapped his hands twice, whereupon the servant reappeared and handed a glass of some curious blue wine to Luecath. "Drink," the old man said. Luecath complied, finding the wine rich and pungent, finding indeed that his mouth and throat had grown numb on the instant. As he drank, the old man spoke to him again. "You seek Azathoth, the Daemon-Sultan. You are brave and persevering, but you are also foolish, for you seek the Daemon-Sultan in the wrong spirit. He who is all, he who sits enthroned at the centre of all chaos,
is everywhere, for chaos has no centre. Every point in the universe of stars is the centre, thus there is no centre, and the Daemon-Sultan lurks nowhere, because he is everywhere. Look within yourself.
But these last words came to Llewellyn Cath as if echoing in some fathomless cavern, for Llewellyn Cath was slipping away, out of his body, out of the dimly lit room, away. Around him now were not dingy earthen walls, but great sable curtains of stars, through which he seemed to fly effortlessly and with stupefying speed. With whole slow-turning galaxies swam around and past him, and suddenly the conviction was upon him that he sped not in one direction through the black abyss, but rather in infinitely many directions, as if in one cataclysmic instant his being had exploded, scattering him in myriad flaming arcs of moving brightnesses, each of which was a point of consciousness all its own, each tracing through limitless space, and knowing that all the others were tracing through limitless space as well. It was the ultimate ecstasy, and the ultimate horror, for in gaining this multiplicity of being, he had lost his unique self. It was like looking out through a billion eyes simultaneously, like being everywhere at once and seeing everything through some deranged insect vision. Some of his points of consciousness looked out upon dead worlds, but some settled on inhabited worlds, and on each of these worlds he was not a living creature merely, but rather was all living creatures looking at all other such creatures. On one world he was men, women, other creatures contemplating the other men and other women and other creatures who were thus contemplating him, and themselves. On other worlds the bodies were different, but the rest was the same. He was innumerable nightmare shapes of life. He was faces looking at faces looking at faces, without end. And in the turmoil of his universal awareness of the countless Llewellyn Caths on all other worlds, in a frenzied cacophony of blended minds mirroring each other, and mirroring each other's mirrorings, he was everywhere. The image of the retinue of monstrous flute-players came back to him, and he knew it now for what it was, a metaphor for the music of the spheres, the silent but all-pervading tones of the universe. And in this realization he knew that he himself was the Daemon-Sultan, had always been the Daemon-Sultan, had always been the object of his own quest. Every face in every village had been the face of Azathoth, but he had needed only to look at his own reflection in a woodland pond to see what he had sought. The multiple cosmic vision grew grainy, faded, dissolved, and he found himself seated once more in the presence of the ancient Li Su, who merely regarded him calmly, though the faintest trail of a smile may have played about the aged lips. Llewellyn Cath, suddenly overcome with emotion, jumped up and bolted out the door, and by that night on the road, heading back in the direction from which he had come, he had left the glittering spires of Beccana far behind him. Night became day, days faded into nights of sleeping briefly under the stars and walking on into new sunrises. A sea voyage came and went like a dream, and villages and valleys and rivers and mountain ranges unfolded before him, and receded behind him as the years rolled by, and one day he was home, embraced by a tearful and older mother and father, back in the village of Sur, in the valley of Ulwar, beneath the sombre face of Black Mountain. But nothing would ever be quite the same again, for he was possessed of a new awareness, a new vision that seeped into his dreams and imparted glimpses of the world to come, with its strife, its bloody wars, its madness. For if the Daemon-Sultan, presiding over all things in the stellar cosmos, colouring all existence with his consciousness, if the Daemon-Sultan was obliged for ever to see himself, looking back at himself out of an infinitude of infinitudes of faces, how could he, or the universe, be sane? And what then of Llewellyn Cath? How could one live, even among the familiar faces of one's homeland, with such a vision as was his? As he saw the reflected face in the pond grow older with the years, Llewellyn Cath's once vibrant mind progressively gave way under the strain that forever weighed upon it, and his senses wandered so pitiably at times that he was many months in contemplating the far from redoubtable task with which he bemusedly occupied himself, the carving and fashioning of a simple bamboo flute, and the final years of his life saw him change beyond all accounting. For idle loungers about the village, though in time they did not remember the way Cath, came to regard as familiar a ragged and enigmatic figure leaning wind-blown in the village square, a flute-player piping idiotically, monotonously, weirdly upon a carven flute held clumsily in palsied hands, endlessly piping his cacophony of eerie notes, his Eulaland litany to his god, to the one whose face inscrutable was everywhere and everything and everyone, the final derangement lying behind all being, the gibbering madness of existence, pervasive, present in the very wind, tainting the very sunlight, the Daemon-Sultan, Azathoth.